Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us today on the second session in the series of Collaborative Teams That Work webinars with Gavin Grift and Colin Sloper. Firstly, in the spirit of reconciliation, Hawker Brownlow Education acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respects to their elders past, present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. So now I would like to introduce you to your presenters for today, Gavin Grift and Colin Sloper. So Gavin Grift connects with national and international audiences through his keynotes, seminars and coaching services on how to cultivate authentic collaboration, build success in others and genuinely commit to reflective practice. His belief in the development of defined professional autonomy for educators both challenges and connects the head and heart of his audiences. Having taught in schools and coached educators for over 25 years, Gavin understands the specific challenges that teachers face. As a leading Hawker Brownlow education author, he has combined his beliefs, research and experiences on the importance of collaboration and coaching to co-author numerous books, including 5 Ways of Being, Teachers as Architects of Learning, Transformative Talk, Transformative Collaboration and the upcoming Collaborative Teams That Work. Colin Sloper is a leading expert and author on professional learning communities. Colin works with systems, schools, leaders and educators to transform them into high-performing professional learning communities and build their capabilities to operate as members of highly effective collaborative teams. Colin's skills as an educational leader, speaker and coach, alongside his practical advice and knowledge as someone who has transformed schools, are highly sought after by educational organisations across all sectors. He is the co-author of numerous books as well. As a principal, Colin was instrumental in leading his school to become the first recognised PLC at work school in Australia, which subsequently led him to supporting other systems and schools across the country in their PLC journey. And with that, I will now pass you over to Gavin and Colin.
Thank you. Thanks you very much, Olivia, and thank you to Hawker Brownlow Education for giving us a platform to be able to share our work with our colleagues. We really appreciate it. And welcome to everybody, or welcome back if you were with us on the first series. We look forward to working with you or working with you again. Just a reminder, make sure you get those questions into chat as we go through or the Q&A so Olivia can collect them and we'll hopefully have some time at the end to address any questions that some people might have. Okay, so our session 2 today, as we dig deeper into the collaborative teams that work is around practical and time-saving pieces of advice, really, what collaborative teams do to ensure that every second counts. And this is really part of our roadmap that we've been that we're using for this series, but specifically, if you have a look at last week, and Colin will just touch on that again for those of you who didn't join us, we went through 6 requirements needed for collaborative teams to thrive. But in this session, we're going to really look at 22 practical tips to successfully implement the 12 actions of a cycle of learning. You can imagine these 3 webinars are really the culmination of 11 to 12 years of work that Colin and I have done together and with many other people. So just to try and find things that we felt was really useful for people on a webinar was half the challenge. But today what we've decided is to give you these practical tips because they seem to be the ones from our experience working with schools that seem to have the most resonance and to provide the greatest challenge, I guess. And then next time we'll have a look at those five ways of working with you. No worries. So today, by the end of this session, we want you to have really dug deeper into these 12 actions and some of their associated tasks, which Colin will get to in just a moment to remind you if you were with us last time or to introduce you to it if you weren't. Develop insights into how to overcome common challenges associated with working as a collaborative team. Really, the whole session is around the challenges associated with doing this work. I mean, really, if this work was so easy, we would all be doing it and we certainly wouldn't be doing this, right? So we want to give you some tips about how to navigate that. And a thread running through our 3 sessions, just continuing to learn about the true work and focus of high-performing collaborative teams. What does it look like? What does it feel like? What does it transpire as when we're doing the work that truly constitute professional learning communities? Okay, so the book, Collaborative Teams That Work, that Olivia just mentioned is where we've got this from, the content. Well, it's not really the book, is it? Because it's that 12 years that culminated in the book. So basically what we're going to be doing is providing you with insights from this. But of course, really, in some ways, you can only touch the surface, but we'll certainly try and dig deep in some of those areas. Okay, so Cole,
Thanks, Gavin, and welcome back to those people who were with us last time, and welcome to anyone joining us for the first time. What we'd like to do is just remind people and revise for those people who weren't with us some of the basic principles that we introduced last week on which this work is based. Last time we introduced the metaphor that we see a school as the orange, and we use this orange metaphor to distinguish between the two levels of work that have to happen in a true and authentic PLC. So the whole school is the outside skin of the orange, and of course, serving the school are the collaborative teams within that skin. So if we look at our concept of a professional learning community, the whole school there represents the leadership of the school, everyone working in the same direction. So at the whole school level, there's a number of tasks and challenges that need to be overcome to ensure that the collaborative teams, the segments of the orange, can actually do the work we want them to do. Last time we spent quite a bit of time talking about clarity, and one of the things we dissected with almost forensic detail was our definition of a professional learning community. So we introduced last time that a professional learning community is educated, is committed to working collaboratively. That's the what. The what of a PLC is educated, committed to working collaboratively. They are going to be using action research and recurring collective cycles of learning. It's the how, the methodology that the teams use to do this important work. And of course, the why are we doing that? We're going to inquire into and increase the impact of our teaching practice to achieve better results for the students they serve. The understanding of this definition, clarity of this definition, sits at the whole school level, and it's one of the important tasks we see for everyone in a PLC is that there is crystal clarity around that definition. You might remember, if you're with us, last time we looked at the 6 requirements. We framed them up as requirements for a PLC, and we dug down deeper into each of those various components. The reason we did that is, again, going back to that question of commitment. Commitment can't be built to a process unless there is crystal clarity and a united view of what that work is. So understanding what collaboration is, action research, collective cycles of inquiry, teaching practice are absolutely vital in having a common language around how teams are going to work in a professional learning community. Last time we also reviewed the 4 critical questions that comes from Learning by Doing by DeFore, Ecker, Manny and Matos. And those 4 questions, you will remember, frame up a cycle of action research. So the first question was, what do we want our students to learn? The second question, how we know our students are learning. Question 3 is how we respond when some students don't learn. And question 4 is, how will we enrich and extend the learning for students who are already proficient? And last time, one of the things we said, and one of my realisations and Gavin's realisations when we've been going out working in schools over the last decade or more, is that the art of being a high-performing collaborative team is not necessarily to answer those questions, but to do the work that ensures those questions get answered. I mentioned before that those questions are really the attempt in Learning by Doing to set up and to outline a very simple cycle of action research. And you can see on your screen there the 6 steps in action research. Well, the 4 critical PLC questions are really the attempt to actually outline a very simple cycle of action research coming from student learning. So teams that have been convinced that they need to be answering all of those questions at every meeting have actually been led down the wrong path, because some of those questions become more relevant at certain parts of the cycle of learning that we introduced last time. If we have a look here, these were the 12 actions in the cycle of learning that we introduced people to. And the first phase of the cycle of learning is actually preparing the learning. And as you can see in the preparing the learning phase, there are 5 actions that collaborative teams undertake. The second phase of the cycle of learning is implementing the learning. And this is made up of 4 actions that are carried out by collaborative teams, both at their meetings and back in their classrooms as they start to implement the learning that they've planned. And the final stage of the cycle of learning is the reviewing the learning. And as you can see, there are 3 distinct actions that teams carry out in their classrooms, and then, of course, back at their collaborative team meetings.
Thanks, Colin. Really useful refresher. So hopefully that brings everybody back into this space, those who were with you last time. And if not, hopefully it gives you just a bit of a frame as we dig deeper into here. Because what we're going to now do, Olivia said before, grab a pen, you know, if you've got a cup of tea, it's actually, if you're in Melbourne or Victoria, it's a public holiday tomorrow, it might be something stronger, but just grab something, a pen, pad, and get ready, because we want to just share 22 tips based on what we know are the biggest challenges that relate to each of those actions that Colin just reminded us of towards the end of that review piece. Okay, so let's just get straight into it and move through these. I'm going to go at a fairly rapid pace here, so any questions, make sure you pop them down. And please note, some will be more relevant than others for you, of course, because it'll depend on where you're at in terms of this work in your own context. So let's start with phase 1, preparing the learning, and let's go to action 1, Cole, which is really around mapping the learning pathway. Okay, this addresses that question, what do we want our students to learn? So the first action of the team, of the collaborative team, prior to sitting down and planning, of course, is in terms of their learning activities, is working out, well, what is the learning going to look like? And with every one of these actions, there's a whole lot of tasks that teams undertake that are obviously outlined in our book. But we're just going to focus on one and those that seem the most critical and the one that potentially have greatest challenges. So I'm going to pick up on this one around identifying the skills, knowledge, and dispositions at the curriculum level of proficiency for the prioritised standard, which is a really important task, obviously, when you're mapping the learning pathway for your students as a collaborative team. So it's a major challenge around that and some tips we would like to give you, Cole.
So the first challenge here related to that specific task, related to that first action, is that the school doesn't have a guaranteed and viable curriculum. What we mean by this, and we're referring to Mazzano's research, when we talk about guaranteed, we're talking about there is crystal clarity and agreement by teachers who are delivering the content on what are the key skills, knowledge, or dispositions that sit behind the learning program they're about to implement. So everybody in that team who is delivering the same content is guaranteeing that all students in their classes are going to be taught the things that the team or school have identified as being the most essential. The viable part of guaranteed and viable curriculum means that there is sufficient time devoted to ensuring that all students reach the level of proficiency required. So the challenge that teams can face when they're implementing this first action of a cycle of learning is that the school doesn't have a guaranteed and viable curriculum. They haven't worked out or determined what the essential learnings are. Here's some tips to overcome that. First of all, when the school is or the team is developing the guaranteed and viable curriculum, what we are talking about here is prioritisation of the essential over elimination. This is not taking a hatchet to the curriculum, our mandated curriculums, and chucking out the huge bits or throwing out the bits we don't like. What we are doing here is saying we are going to identify the absolutely crucial and essential pieces that all students must acquire as a result of this cycle of learning. The other things will still be as taught, but not necessarily with as much vigilance and as much monitoring as the things that we are saying are absolutely essential, because in the time that we have to do this work, there's not enough time to do this over the whole curriculum. The second helpful tip here is to build that guaranteed and viable curriculum both horizontally and vertically. So there's going to be the need to have very good communication channels. We've seen schools do this in 2 ways, and there is what we think a better way. Sometimes if the school hasn't done this, then the team can do it. When they forecast and look ahead at an upcoming unit of work, they can go back to the curriculum documentation and determine for themselves what the actual essential skills, knowledge, and dispositions are that they need to focus on. We think it's much better if at some point the school working in teams that are delivering this content have taken time and developed the school's guaranteed and viable curriculum, so that when the teams come together and start to implement this process, that part of the work has already been done. So the work of the team at this point is to review that guaranteed and viable curriculum, to check there is clarity and understanding from all team members about what parts have been deemed as being essential. We need to make sure, as I just said, we see the development of the guaranteed and viable curriculum as the responsibility of the whole school. We can do it in the team, but it can become very piecemeal and haphazard. We can do it that way so it doesn't stop us doing the work. But over a period of time, we would hope to see at the whole school level that time has been devoted to that most important task. So that finishes up that first action that Gavin introduced. The second action in preparing the learning phase of the cycle of learning is to prepare the pre-assessment. And as you can see on the right-hand side, this is directly addressing or doing the work that will address the second question: how do we know our students are learning? Again, there are 4 tasks that fit under the preparing the assessment action, but we're just going to focus on that first one, which is to review current learning data that relates to the cycle or develop the common formative assessment if no relevant data exists.
Okay, so the challenge here around this one, we've mapped the learning pathway, and we're as a collaborative team, we're working out what is our pre-assessment. Remember, this is a focus on learning before it's a focus on teaching. And the challenge can become that the team doesn't take into account what the students already know. And that's a massive challenge we've seen. When there's a focus on teaching and a focus on content first, what happens is those units or those cycles of learning are rolled out without any attempt to look at what the student's prior knowledge is doing for that. So some tips around that to help you move forward in that is, first of all, see your role as focusing on student learning, not just delivering content. This is massive. Remember, what we're trying to bring to is the biggest challenges we're seeing in schools. And even though you may have heard this, if you're familiar with the DeFore's work, particularly the PLC at Work process, but when we talk about a relentless focus on learning over teaching, this is what we mean. That's why we also, by the way, call it a pre-assessment, not a pre-test. It's a pre-assessment just to work out, well, what's the current reality? So your collaborative teams in the cycle of learning, before the cycle of learning starts, are committing to get together and working out the best way to find out what these students actually know in order to think about the content you're going to deliver. So it's important the collaborative team sees their role as focusing on student learning, not just delivering content. Second tip, just to help you around this, please don't plan the teaching program until you have a current reality of your students. Now, I would argue individual teachers or pairs of teachers, some teams do this really, really well. This is just what we do, right? We need to find out what students know in order to respond appropriately. The difference here is we're doing this as a collaborative team in the prioritised area that Colin has just spoken about, and ensuring that together we are getting a collective reality of where these students are at so that we can start to really target our content, our approaches, our program, whatever that may look like, around what the reality is. When this is done when a unit starts or when it's done without complete consensus, it can be problematic for the rest of the cycle, which is why it's an important piece. Okay. So moving on to the next one, we've established the pre-assessment. We're now going to administer it, of course. So we've, as a collaborative team, agreed on what that is. So now we're up to administering the pre-assessment, which again addresses a critical question in the DeFore's 4 questions. So let's administer the pre-assessment, but just a word of warning, again, something we've noticed and a challenge to be aware of.
So at this point, one of the challenges can be is that the assessment practices, that pre-assessment, isn't common across all team members, okay? Because we need to establish a current reality of not only the students in our classroom, but the students in our cohort, we need to make sure that the pre-assessment is common across all team members. So here's some helpful tips for you. It's really important, and that's why we've called the first phase of the work of a collaborative team in implementing the cycles of learning, is that planning for the learning. It's important to give yourself adequate time to do this work. So give yourself time to design that formative assessment that the team is agreeing to use as the way of getting that current reality of their the children in their classes. We find, or I found recently, a lot of teams or schools tend to almost subcontract this out to commercial companies who have got products at the market. We see the collaborative team as a learning team. When they're developing and really thinking about the design of that common formative assessment they're going to implement, they're actually becoming more knowledgeable, more understanding of those important skills, knowledge and dispositions that they're going to be teaching anyway. So the very act of constructing and talking about what are good assessment items that might be used or good assessment techniques that could be used to gain this current reality is a way for the team to actually dig deeper into the content that they're going to be teaching. Another helpful tip here is, because we're going to be doing something with that assessment, it's not just to get a starting point, but it's a number of tasks that the collaborative teams will actually do, use the data they've gathered from the pre-assessment. It's really important to make sure that the conditions under which the team are going to administer that assessment are also common. So not only is the assessment common, but the conditions it's being implemented in is also common. So that requires the team to talk about that. Are we going to, answer kids' questions if there's questions that they might have during the assessment session? One I've seen recently where there's been a bit of a letdown is they were doing some work, a team in a primary school was doing some work around tables facts. In one classroom, they removed the charts from the front of the room with the tables facts. In the other classroom, they hadn't. So the results coming back from the assessments were wildly different. So making sure that those assessment practices and the actual assessment tool is the legitimate, ideal in terms of making sure that the collaborative teams have discussions, in-depth discussions around that.
Mm-hmm. In fact, just before we go into the next part, Colin, I think the reason everyone that we're sharing that is because that's one of the most common challenges we've seen in teams. This is the best anecdote to saving time, just getting ahead of the game. What we find is a lot of this is done when the unit or the cycle of learning starts, and then you've got to play catch up, and what happens is overwhelm and disengagement to the process. So I don't know about you, Colin, is it like, ideally 3 or 4 weeks before that we're administering that after we've agreed in order to
And really, if you think of this as reoccurring collective cycles of inquiry, the team will be ending up the previous cycle of inquiry. So they're doing that and doing that in their classrooms. But at their collaborative team meetings, what they are clearly doing is getting ready for the next cycle of learning.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you.
The fourth action here in this phase of the cycle of learning is then to actually respond to the identified student learning needs. So we've implemented the pre-assessment. That data has been collated and is now being brought back to the collaborative team to actually start discussing and start to formulate their plans of what they're going to do as they respond to those identified student needs. And one of the important uses of that pre-assessment is to develop the team's SMART goal based on that current level of proficiency as determined by the pre-assessment. And of course, there's some challenges around that as well, Gavin.
Yep, so the biggest challenge here is that a SMART goal is not developed for each cycle of learning. And again, this is we're choosing for this webinar the most common we see. And when a SMART goal is not developed for each cycle of learning, then the question becomes, are we a collaborative team? Because a team assumes that we have a common goal. You can't be a team without a common goal. And obviously in the work that focuses on learning, that common goal has to be centered around achievement and around something that we can measure. So SMART goals obviously have been around for quite some time. They're synonymous in a whole range of other industries. Business use them a lot as well. But of course, in a school, a SMART goal is most useful for a team because it gives us the opportunity to be able to set goals and ensure the team has a way of taking collective responsibility. But we've seen this be confused, misrepresented many times. So let's give you some tips about that to help you a little bit. First of all, ensure the goals that the team set are SMART goals and relate to the levels of student learning. So the reason we like SMART goals, the reason the DeFores and the PLC at Work process advocated for SMART goals is because of what sits in the acronym. They are specific. So there's no room for fluff goals in a collaborative team. Why? Because they're measurable. We're making sure that now that we've got this assessment back, we can see and we can make some goals around, well, where are they and where do we need them to be? They're contextually appropriate because they're attainable. That's the A. We know they're attainable because we know our students, we know where they are, we know the spread, and we can set goals that push and challenge but are realistic. They're results orientated. Okay, so it means that we are basing it on the growth in learning against what we have decided is the best way to look at understanding from that pre-assessment discussion we previously had. And of course, they're time bound. Okay, so we know that we can fit this within the time space that we've got. And these don't have to be onerous. What we find is sometimes I've seen teams spend a meeting getting a SMART goal together. But if the first 3 actions have been done really thoroughly and those tasks we've been referring to are part of the collaborative team process, this just becomes a given. It can be done honestly in 5 minutes. Let me just give you some examples here. There's a primary school one just here in the corner in the end of this learning cycle, term 4, week 6, which will be the end of the cycle, for the place value prioritise standard, because we don't do this necessarily for every standard. We do this for our prioritised standards that are the most critical, which I'll come back to in a moment, in our collaborative teams. For the place value prioritised standard, 85% of students will be at or above the required level of proficiency, of which, of course, they'll have identified what that level of proficiency looks like. From a secondary school perspective, and of course, these are just examples, they look different depending on the context, but by the end of the year, so this is more a year-long goal of teams that are meeting regularly because they've got science learning sitting at the heart of their endeavours, we will have increased the percentage of students achieving 4 or more on the 7-point scale that represents their end of year mark in each science subject. So the school has a 7-point scale and 4 represents being at standard in the school. And they're going to do that by 25%. And if they can do that, this will mean 125 more students will be finishing the year at standard or above for their subject. And you can see how that goal then becomes the catalyst for really encouraging collective responsibility, even though we may teach them separately. So just a couple of examples for you so you can see what they look like in practice. A couple of other tips here on SMART goals. Set and own the SMART goal for each cycle of learning yourselves. Okay, they can't be given to you. So set and own the SMART goal for each cycle of learning and develop them as the team. It's your goal, only you know what the students are showing, and that's your opportunity to not only measure their understanding and their learning, but of course the impact that our teaching practice is having. Ensure, lastly here, that the SMART goal created contributes and supports the achievement of the school's annual SMART goals. We don't really want to be misaligning our efforts. So what collaborative teams are doing at the broader picture is doing the work that's contributing to the whole school improvement goals. And so we're making sure that when we're working on, for example, if you took the place value example that Colin gave and that was in that example there, or the tables one, Colin, that you gave, that's obviously an important part of number, which may be a very important part of the annual implementation plan that's set in terms of a goal that says we want this many students achieving a lot more by the end of the year. So there's real alignment between what the work of collaborative teams are doing with what the leadership team have set out as part of the agenda to continue to support the school's improvement goals. And of course, they would relate to other data that they would have. But everybody's working together. It's that sense of collective responsibility. But done like this, SMART goals for teams don't become onerous. They don't become overwhelming and they don't become confusing. They actually become something that really bind the team together. All right, so if we go to action 5, which is the last action of preparing the learning aspect of the cycle of learning before we actually start sort of teaching, we're now designing the learning program. And again, Colin, I think in both our experiences, a lot of the time we're seeing collaborative teams start with designing a learning program. So these first 4 actions are critical if we're going to set up a professional learning community or the collaborative teams that serve it in a way that impacts students most effectively. So within Design the Learning Program, again, there's a whole lot of tasks that 3 of them that teams undertake, but we're going to just provide you just a little bit of insight into develop engaging learning activities that clearly relate to the skills and knowledge that the team wants students to learn. It seems very simple, right? But it's actually deceptively complex. So just a couple of things to be aware of and some tips to help you.
One of the biggest challenges here is this misalignment between the learning activities and the learning goals, those skills, knowledge and dispositions that have been identified previously as being the most essential things. As Gavin mentioned before, many collaborative teams start at this point. They just come together and go, wow, our job is to plan activities. Given the other tasks that the team's done in this phase of the cycle of learning, there should now be the ability for the team to have a greater alignment of those learning activities to those targeted skills, knowledge and dispositions that we want the students to reach proficiency in. So that's the challenge. Some helpful helpful tips to overcome that is to check the activities designed. So to actively check the activities that are being collected or designed or gathered against and match them to the specific skills, knowledge or dispositions that are being focused on during this cycle of learning. I've sat through a number of collaborative team meetings where with all good intentions, the teachers get very, very excited. They plan these really great activities. And then when you have them check it against the particular skill, knowledge or disposition they're trying to students, the activity doesn't relate to that in a strong enough way. We're all time poor in schools. It's one of the things Gavin and I hear all the time. It's about, the lack of time we've got. What we need to make sure is that we're using that time and, the time we've got with our students through targeted activities that directly focus on the things we want them to learn. Another helpful tip here is really, framing up yourself. So the collaborative team asking themselves specifically the following questions. What are the specific strategies and activities or programs that will help the students achieve the learning goals we've identified for this circle of learning? So having that as a conscious thought the whole time that they're collecting, designing, developing these learning activities will result in the activities designed being more aligned to the specific things we want the kids to master. And the second part of the question is, as we look at what the students already know, because we've just determined that from the pre-assessment and our discussion of the pre-assessment data we've collected, what might the first few weeks of this cycle of learning look like? Yes, these are all the essential things, the dispositions and knowledge and skills we want them to learn. Let's plan out and really just focus on the first couple of weeks so that we're not spreading ourselves too thinly, and we are really making sure that those designed activities are as strong as they possibly can be and are as aligned as they can be.
And again, we ask teams to put those questions in their agendas and make sure that they're in some teams, one person's allocated to be the checker to ensure that there's alignment so we don't shoot ourselves in the foot, because we can get very excited about what we can do. We get very excited about ideas and activities that sometimes it's quite easy to actually lose sight of what's really important.
Having been through the planning and learning cycle, you can see how now teams are well set up when they go back in their classrooms and continue the implementing the learning. They're well set up in terms of what they've planned, the thoughts they've put behind the actual learning programs they're going to be implementing. So in this phase of the learning cycle, the first action is to obviously in the classrooms implement that learning program. And in this phase, there's a number of things, tasks that we suggest collaborative teams can be looking at to inform their teaching in their classroom. The one we're going to focus on here is explicitly teach the identified skills and knowledge related to that cycle.
Okay, so for everybody, this will be obviously very familiar. We've got clarity. We know that clarity precedes competence, but the challenge can be students don't learn in the time allocated. I think that almost if I could hear you all be a chorus of you hear my story, right? Because there is only so much time in the day and time is a massive factor. So what are some of the things that we can do to ensure that this becomes less of an issue over time? Because it can become less of an issue over time. Part of it's actually already been answered in the action before this, if we've done that well. But moving into this space, let's give you just a couple of ideas here. One, alter the pacing guide based on the current evidence of student learning. See, this is important. Think about what you've got in your schools. Have you got a week-by-week planner that's almost set out for 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 10 weeks, that's actually already full of the activity strategies and approaches? Or have you just got 2 or 3 weeks, as Colin just mentioned, so that you can alter the pacing guide, we call it, rather than a curriculum planner or a unit planner or a program planner. You have a pacing guide that you can alter based on the current evidence of student learning. So as you are teaching this in your classrooms, you can alter the pace of what you're being taught based on this, so that you don't get overwhelmed by content. We'll come back to that in a moment. And if there's questions about this, please make sure you get them down. All right, so second tip, collaboratively monitor student learning regularly through the cycle of learning. So this is in the individual classroom. We'll talk more about what collaborative teams to do that in a moment. But remember, this is what you're doing in your classroom. So again, we know from formative assessment research and just from what, John Hattie's talked about in regards to a lot of his work around success criteria. We know if we monitor student learning regularly, because we know what we're looking for, that it's going to make a bigger difference. But really, unless you've done those first 5 actions well, this becomes difficult. So collaboratively, as a team, monitor, bring it back to the team. What's happening? Where's it going? We'll give you some more tips about that in a moment, and ensure that you're doing that regularly throughout the cycle of learning. I want to before we go into this one, Colin, just remind everybody, remember that you're meeting in your collaborative teams now as you're doing the unit of work. Your first collaborative team meeting around this is maybe the first week, because all of the other pieces you've done are before the unit started. So most of your work as a collaborative team, when you are actually rolling the unit out, if you like, is monitoring the impact of learning. So collaboratively monitor student learning regularly throughout the cycle of learning. And lastly, just around this piece, use the team's problem-solving capabilities when students aren't learning in the expected time frame. So what about if they're not getting it? What happens? What do we do? This is a question for the team. You are a problem-solving team. We've seen the most amazing restructuring done, the most amazing prioritising, thinking, even advice to teachers individually in classrooms about how to structure groups and use their time in lessons for different kids. We don't know if we don't ask. And remember, the people who are most powerful and useful to you in your professional learning as teachers are your colleagues in a collaborative team. That's what job-embedded professional learning is. So use the team's problem-solving capabilities, and the more you use it, the better we get at problem-solving, to ensure that people go in armed with a whole range of different ideas, support, structures, thinking, to support those students who may need more time, which we'll also get to in a moment. Remember, in our first session, we said when confronted with a challenge, the committed heart will search for a solution. The undecided heart searches for an escape. So we know that a professional learning community is a 10% admire problem, 90% look for solutions kind of school kind of team. So we're using that in our collaborative team to address issues like, what are we going to do for this group of students who are still struggling to understand these key concepts or these knowledge, skills and dispositions we want them to. All right, this will relate to some of these other actions as we go around that inner cycle. Okay, we're going to look at 7 here. And that is monitor the impact of instruction as we go. And so this is monitoring the impact of our instruction. And in our efforts to do that as a classroom teacher, there's many things that we do, but we're just going to pick up on this one, which we find is the most powerful in terms of this action. Use quick checks to identify the effectiveness of your interventions and adjust your teaching practice accordingly. This, to me, is where the rubber hits the road on whether the collaborative team is truly acting out that definition or not. Colin, some challenge and tips around that.
Yeah, the challenge really here is that the feedback that teachers are gathering doesn't specifically inform the instruction. So it's really important, as Gavin mentioned, through quick checks, whatever the unobtrusive assessments that the individual teacher is doing, is giving them feedback on their instruction. We're not only implementing those quick checks, those unobtrusive assessments to measure student learning, but they're also giving us indication of the strength of our teaching practice. If the kids aren't learning it, okay, it's not about blaming the students. It's about going back and saying, okay, what do we need to change? What could we alter in my teaching practice that will allow more of those students to learn it? So some tips here to overcome that would be ensure that the results of those common quick checks become the catalyst for collaborative dialogue and discussion for strengthening teaching practice. Remember, in our definition of a PLC, it was about, strengthening teaching practice to get a better results for the students we serve. We're not going to improve student learning unless the majority of our discussion is data-informed, evidence-informed discussion around which teaching strategies are having the greatest impact on the learning of our students in our classroom and the students in our cohort. Another helpful tip here is to understand that the power of the common and individual quick check, so common in that everyone in the team is going to implement in their classrooms because something's going to happen with that data, or individually in my own classroom, is to make those adjustments to teaching practice in real time. We don't have to wait till the end of the unit and discover some kids haven't learnt it. We know in real time whether our students are learning or not learning, and therefore can take action in real time to overcome and prevent that outcome from being what the reality is. So it's understanding that we're using those quick checks to make sure we're trying to identify the best teaching practice. And there's some examples there of exit slips, sticky notes, criteria checkers, classroom polling, card cluster, 321, which we go into in the book as some quick ways of getting that information. So again, these quick checks don't intrude and take more time out of your teaching program. They can be done quickly to get the information you need. We're now up to action 8 in implementing the learning. And at this point, we're going to be analysing the instructional practice that are having the greatest impact. And as you can see, this action is actually addressing 3 of the 4 critical PLC questions. And again, there's the tasks associated with this action. And we're going to focus on, or Gavin's going to focus on, discussing how to adjust the current teaching practice so that those most impactful strategies can be implemented in all classrooms.
Okay, so the biggest challenge is that we don't make excuses for the lack of student learning. Now, this might not be a challenge for you. Remember what I said to you before? For some of you, this won't be a challenge. For some of you, it is for a challenge. We're sort of going by here over 12 years, observational data of the challenges teams have, or even individual teachers have, because this is hard. And when you really think about this, the circle that Colin just mentioned means we're now going and meeting again as a collaborative team. And if we're doing what Colin just mentioned, we're putting an impact of our teaching practice under the spotlight. Is what I'm doing as a teacher working, or is it not working? And that means that we need to really have fostered, and we'll talk more about this in session 3 in terms of ways how to do that, but in a collaborative team, foster a climate where we can talk about some of these pieces. Now, one tip we've got for you that we think is really important, and we know it can be an issue, is to name and accept differences between cohorts of students and commit to not making excuses for non-learning. One of the things we hear a lot, and I'm guilty of it, it's things that I've done as well as a teacher, and counterproductive to what we're trying to do, is comparing the cohorts and then making an excuse for that cohort. When a team can sit down and at the highest level when there's relational trust and say, yes, there are differences in these cohorts, and some cohorts are more challenging than others because fill in the dot, and you'd have many, many fill in the dots, then we can name it. But then we put it aside and say, okay, but even though we know that, we're still going to continue to make our efforts on focusing on the fact that they can and they will reach the standard that we've set out for them. And our job as a problem-solving collaborative team is to support and ensure that the ideas and the problem-solving we use helps everybody, including maybe teachers who have more challenging cohorts, to do that. So they feel an absolute professional level of support that really helps them in that area. So it's being explicit about that and communicating that clearly and making sure that that kind of doesn't bubble under the surface, because that can actually start to contaminate teams. All right. Another tip just around this piece is ensure a significant amount of time has been allocated in the meetings to the discussion of teaching practices. Okay, so it's really interesting. You've got to look back at your agenda. What we do is we take teams through and have a look at their agendas. They self-review their agendas against what they're putting their emphasis on. Okay, and if the preparing the learning phase is being done really well, that means that they've given themselves more time to do this, because this is where the work happens. This is where the professional learning happens. This is when you support each other to shift your practice. So making sure there's not just 10 minutes, but sometimes you have 30 minutes in the meeting where you're really discussing the practices that we are using that's helping, which we all do, right? I'm sure everyone out there could say, yep, in the chat, we do this, we do this, we do it informally. I talk to my trusted colleagues, we talk about our practice. But it's being very considered and giving ourselves regular time in meetings to just sit and talk about what are we doing, how is it making a difference, how do we know, to ensure that we don't sort of go over that or make that surface kind of dialogue, because this is the dialogue that actually makes the collaborative team a collaborative team of a professional learning community. So ensure that there's significant time there. By the way, if you're thinking there's not enough time, we don't have enough time, we've got other things to do, that's actually a symptom of broader problems and other problems that may exist that we do still need to address, that we haven't got time to address here. Okay, so draw heavily from the team's collective expertise and commit to implementing the strongest teaching practices in all classroom. So remember that this collaborative team process is about strengthening individual practice and strengthening collective practice. And what we're doing here is looking at, well, which of the teaching practices are seen to be working best? How does that play out? How do you go about teaching that? If the Think Aloud is a strategy that's working really well to help students read and they're comprehending at levels that we haven't seen in other classrooms, what is that strategy? Can somebody show us what that looks like? Can I come and watch you do that? Is there any professional reading I've got on that? Do we have a literacy coach at our school who'll be able to help in that area? This is when we draw on the resources internally and externally to commit to these strongest teaching practices, because we know we've got some evidence and we're collecting some information that's letting us know that this is going to be really, really impactful on the students and of course on our own learning. Okay. So 9, as we're coming down, we adopt those most impactful instructional practices in all team members' classroom. Notice that's a rectangle. That's now what we're doing in the classroom. We're now adopting it. This isn't one of those times when we go, sounds like a dialogue, but now I'm going to go back into my classroom and kind of do what I was going to do anyway. The sign of a really good collaborative team is that they're going back then and they're trialing those pieces based on the conversations that they've had in their meetings that were really targeted in that area. And the task we're going to look at here is, as a team, implement interventions to ensure you enhance student learning. So, Colin, that's a big one, but let's just spend a bit of time on that.
One of the challenges here, and this can apply in your own classroom or across classrooms, so grouping doesn't have to be necessarily across classrooms, it can be in your own classrooms. The student groupings lacks flexibility. We almost, in some cases, they become fixed. It almost becomes a pseudo form of streaming. We expect a lower standard from those students, so we actually put them in that group and they kind of stay in that bottom group as they move through the school year. The aim here is to make sure that we're moving students out of those groups as quickly as possible. We're intervening, overcoming the learning issue that they're having and getting them back onto the things they are meant to be learning. So one of the tips here is to utilise that specific information from the quick checks to monitor and adjust those groupings. So we don't have to wait till the end of the cycle of learning. We've got information that we're getting on a daily basis from the quick checks we're implementing in our classrooms, which means we can adjust. If we find we've had a group of students working on something specifically, a particular skill that they haven't mastered, and we see some of the students master that, we want them out of that group as quickly as possible. If there's some students who still haven't mastered that, we may need them in a small group to continue that work through in another session, but those other students don't need to be there if we've seen them actually mastering it. So again, it's the use of the information we're gathering from those quick checks to actually adjust the groupings that we've got happening in our classroom or across classrooms. Another helpful tip here is to look and try and carve out time for additional time and support for those students who might be struggling with their learning. We know from reality, I know from being a teacher in schools, that not all students learn in the same time and in the same way. So looking for other opportunities where there might be some time in our program time or our lessons that we have with the students where we can actually give them more work on these things that we have said are absolutely essential that they must learn. So it's really important about that. We talked last time, or we said last time, that, more important than curriculum is the question of the methods of teaching, so our teaching practice, and the spirit in which the teaching is given. In other words here, the spirit is we want every student in our class to reach proficiency in those skills, knowledge and dispositions that we have deemed as essential. So the spirit or the belief that sits behind that is I will do whatever I can to make sure that I'm giving those kids every opportunity to reach that standard of proficiency that we want.
And that becomes collective mantra. Okay, so last piece, Cole.
Yeah, and the last phase we're up to now is we've been implementing that learning cycle, and people will have seen that I won't go back, I'll go forward, that this loop in the middle, that green loop on the in the bottom right-hand corner, you might go around a number of times, depending on how complex the skills, knowledge and disposition is for the cycle of learning. So this phase of the learning cycle is to review the learning. And the first action there is to obviously administer the post-assessment. So if we go through, it is really the only task associated with that is to actually administer that so that you can actually gauge whether you are close to or have achieved that SMART goal that you set earlier in the learning cycle. So Gav, over to you.
One of the tasks back in Action 2 that teams take is they've already planned for this post-assessment way back then, so they're ready for this. We just didn't take you through that before, but the administration date of the post-assessment is determined by the timetable, not levels of student proficiency. And so again, it's a pacing issue. We've got week 8 where we're going to put in this post-assessment, but you might not need that until week 6. So let's just give us a tip around how we can be more flexible around that. We utilise the team's progress towards achieving the SMART goal to make the decision of when to administer the post-assessment, not because it's week 8 in the cycle of learning. We could save time. We could be doing this in week 6 because of everything Colin and I just outlined in that in a loop. We realise that we're pretty close to this SMART goal. So now's probably the time to be putting in the post-assessment and finding out where we're at, because we could be spending the last 2 weeks doing a whole lot of enrichment or extension or focusing with some students on further interventions around where they're needing to. So we try and make sure that happens. Now, we often get questions and we work with leadership teams as well as with collaborative teams. Remember, they have to be working together, because one of the things that can get in the way, of course, is whole school assessment schedules or inflexibility in whole school program planning. And so there has to be dialogue between collaborative teams and leadership teams to work through those issues for this to be able to thrive. Okay. Last 2. 11, determine the team's impact on student learning. So now as a collaborative team, you're meeting again and you're determining, well, what's our impact been on student learning? And these last 2 actions, by the way, are 2 that we have seen drop off the fastest, particularly if we're not organised in those first 5 actions. Decide whether to postpone and later visit the cycle. So there's 3 tasks associated with this that collaborative teams put on their agenda, and one of them is to make a decision about whether they need to postpone and to revisit this later.
So one of the challenges here is, and we constantly hear this in schools, is we can't continually extend the time for a cycle of learning until all students have mastered those required skills and knowledge. The ultimate outcome of that, if we were going to make sure every student had got it, then we could be doing perhaps one cycle of unit 1 unit of instruction for the whole year, and the outcome would still be at the end, we would have students who hadn't got it. So here's some helpful tips around that piece. So what we need to do is really take a longer view and determine, what are the opportunities to return to those essential skills, knowledge and dispositions of the learning cycle at another point of time. So Gavin mentioned before in terms of giving that the post-assessment, our quick checks may have shown that, we were allowing 8 weeks for this cycle of learning. Our quick checks have shown that by week 6, most of the kids have got it. We're right to give that that assessment. We've now created some time. We've got 2 weeks up our sleeve. This may be the opportunity to return to some of those essential skills, knowledge and dispositions from other cycles of learning that students hadn't mastered in the first time it was done. So it's really taking that longer view and not just saying, okay, we've got to focus on teaching here. Our aim is just to teach this stuff. It's really that longer view of, okay, if they haven't got it and we have needed to move on in the cycle of learning, then what other opportunities are there? Remember, the very first point was that guaranteed and viable curriculum. If we're saying these things are absolutely essential and vital for kids to know before they go out of our classes, then we have to give them every possible opportunity to learn those things that we have said are absolutely essential. And that brings us to the last action in this reviewing the learning phase of the cycle of learning, and this is to actually action the team's learning, to do something with what they have learned by going through this cycle of inquiry, cycle of learning. So there's many actions that sit here, and as Gavin alluded to before, because many teams are time poor, this is the part that sometimes gets chopped out. But I think Gavin and I would advocate this is probably one of the most important steps, because this is the learning and carrying that learning forward. So Gav, over to you and some challenges that happen here.
Well, just the teams fail to carry forward what they've learnt to the next cycle of learning. Remember, this is ongoing, recurring cycles of learning. And each cycle of learning, in principle, in a professional learning community, becomes catalyst for learning about the next and the next and the next. And that's how we expand our teaching practice. And not only that, it's how we expand our collaborative team practice. So finishing off here, before we open it up for some questions on this webinar, some tips. Address the following questions at the meeting held at the end of the current cycle of learning. So if you leave this webinar with nothing else, please have these questions written down and include them in your agenda when you are getting to the end of your cycle of learning, or the conclusion of a unit of instruction, or whatever it is that you might refer to that as in your school. The first question: what have we learned about our teaching practice that could be carried forward to our next cycle of learning? Identify it, be explicit about it, talk about it, and then look for opportunities already as you start sort of moving towards mapping the learning pathway for your next cycle of learning around, so what do we need to be each mindful of, given what we've just learned about what's making a bigger difference to kids? The second question that would be really important, it's more about your teaching practice, this is about your collaborative practice. So what have we learned about the collaborative process that could be carried forward to our next cycle of learning? What are we learning about ourselves? What are we learning about being problem solvers? What are we learning about being inquirers? What are we learning about working with each other when it's clear that some results in some classes, aren't being as successful as others? What are we learning about how to have those conversations to support people? What are we learning about how to have conversations around the practice that we undertake when we're engaged in teaching an activity or a strategy? So we put that on the agenda and we start to map what that means, and then more cognizant of that, the more aware we become, the more that becomes just the way in which we work, and our collective intelligence just continues to increase. Okay. So summing up here today, what we wanted to do, I haven't got a massive period of time, and I'm sure for many of you be like, yes, okay, that really resonates with me. Yeah, that does address that, but I've got a whole lot of other questions, and that really reassures me because we're doing a wonderful job of that. Generally is how it works. But I hope at least you've got some, practical tips, some practice, some ways of thinking about your practice to continue to successfully implement these 12 actions, which really are the non-negotiable actions of collaborative teams if they're engaged in collaborative work that constitutes being a professional learning community. I really hope that you found some of those things useful. And next week, Colin's paused and gone, next week.
Oh, sorry.
No, I was just going to say next week. Go for it.
Sorry. For the things from Aristotle, for the things we have to learn by doing them, we learn by doing them. So as teams are implementing and learning this process, this cycle of learning process, they're actually doing action research on how to get better. So by doing them, you'll analyse how it went. Your first cycle of learning you implement, when you look back that in several months' time and you look back on your first attempt, you'll laugh and go, wow, why were we thinking that? It's because by doing it, you'll get better and better at doing it until the process itself almost becomes automatic, and you're not thinking of the process anymore. You're thinking about the learning, those deep, rich discussions, that problem solving that you're doing with your collaborative team as you actually implement the process of cycles of learning. Thanks, so I'm going to hand over to Olivia now. I think we're going back because I think we're just about out of time. Olivia, I think, has been collecting any questions that we might be able to give you some answers to.
I have indeed. We've just got a couple, and I am very mindful of the time, so I'll ask them, and hopefully we can wrap this up and let everyone go about their Thursday nights. But Lorraine asks, how does the flexible pacing concept go down with schools that have strict term planners?
Not very well. Lorraine, that's a really obviously an important question and a good question. And I think what it does is go to something broader. That, remember, when we're talking about professional learning communities, we're talking about the leadership team as a collaborative team that's there to create the conditions and the support for those collaborative teams doing this work to thrive. And so that very question becomes a critical question for leadership teams to grapple with, because if the program and the inflexible way in which things are being paced out are getting in the way of us taking a real focus on learning rather than a focus on teaching, then it has to be discussed, because otherwise it really becomes sort of shuffling deck chairs on the Titanic. We end up in the same place, right? Even though the collaborative teams are really working hard to try and do something different. And that can be a real source of frustration. So I could probably spend longer talking to you about that, but I just think that's part of the communication and the process that involves everybody. Colin, did you want to add to that?
And I was just going to add very briefly, Gav, because it goes back to the point you made before. I think it's surfacing some issues around, is the focus on teaching, we're just delivering content, or is this a focus on learning? If we're just delivering content and they're not learning it anyway, what was the point of just delivering the content?
All righty. And our second question, final question, is from Matthew, who asks, in a high school setting, can a collaborative team be made up of teachers who teach different year levels if the objective is skill rather than content? And this pertains, I think, to section 4 of the book. Is that right?
I'll go with it, Olivia. I'm sure it does, yep. So I'll start off and Gav can take over. But definitely in the book, we have a different cycle of learning, same process in terms of the concept of what you're trying to do. But rather than coming from content, we talk about that as coming from a learning issue. So a disparate team can be combined because they've got a similar learning issue that they're trying to solve through that cycle of learning process.
In fact, I think that example we give. So the short answer, Matthew, to that question is yes, yes, and yes, as long as it's really meaning and valuable, that the skill that you're looking at, and it's one that the school's deemed is really important for the learning of your students, and you've got some evidence of that.
Wonderful. Well, as we have run a little bit over time and we haven't got any more questions from the viewers, we'll wrap it up there. Thank you very much to everyone for your time this afternoon. Thank you to all the educators out there for everything that you do, particularly in 2020. We really appreciate it. And thank you to Gavin and Colin for your time and expertise. So with that, enjoy the rest of your days and we'll see you back here for the third session next week. Have a good day.
Beautiful. Thanks,
2
Olivia.
weeks.
Thanks.
2 weeks, Olivia.
Thanks, everybody.
2 weeks.
Oh,
2 weeks' time.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. See you later.